Welcome to Beyond Politics. I'm Paul Hodes with Matt Robeson. We're broadcast on WKXL and available wherever you get your podcasts. We're going to do exactly what this show is all about, to go beyond politics, to talk about an issue that we both care about and that touches the hearts of all of us. Today, at least 44 Americans are being held hostage or wrongfully detained abroad. There's no more vexing, heartbreaking challenge that American leaders face or that the families of those Americans could face. Our guest today is someone who's become a leader, an expert on this situation, though not for reasons that any of us would ever have chosen. Diane Foley is the mother of 5 children, including American freelance conflict journalist James W. Foley, known to his friends and family as Jim. She founded the James W. Foley Legacy Foundation in September 2014, less than a month after his public execution. Diane is currently serving as the president of the foundation, and since 2014, she has helped lead their efforts to fund the start of Hostage USA and the International Alliance for a Culture of Safety, ACOS. Jim was a proud son of New Hampshire. At least we're happy to call him ours, though he came originally from Illinois, and he was a brave journalist, and his legacy lives on in this foundation and its critical work to advocate for the safety of Americans held abroad and especially promote the safety of journalists. Diane Foley, welcome to Beyond Politics.
Thank you so much.
So let's jump right in. Most Americans feel like they recognize Jim's name and may know some of his story, but can you tell us some more about him? Why was he driven to report in conflict zones and in Syria especially? What was his mission?
Well, Jim was an avid reader and loved history. He was very interested in the world, in other cultures, so he was a teacher before he became a journalist, but really felt called to bear witness to the plight of civilians amid conflict of the Arab Spring in 2011, 2012. You know, the hope of these people who have endured such oppression really in their lives. So he was feeling like he was bearing witness to history in the making, if you will, and felt a strong commitment to letting the world know what was going on. Because of the increasing danger, more and more had pulled out of the Middle East, and thus more and more freelancers like Jim had moved into this void of news, actually.
Those of us who are parents, and you're the mother of 5, I'm the father of 3, so we can only imagine what you went through during the period when your son was held. When Americans are held overseas, it's surprising, and I discovered this as a congressional staffer working on cases of Americans wrongfully detained overseas back when I worked for Paul, when I worked for other members of Congress. It's surprising how limited the help from the U.S. government can be. Can you tell us more about working with the government at that time? What did they offer to your family that was helpful or effective? And what were some of the things that the government could and should have been able to do better?
Well, to be honest, my interaction with the government was disappointing. I had no idea about how the government worked, but I tended to believe whatever I was told. And I guess the biggest problem was the fact that there was no coordinated effort to try to bring Jim home. And I was often at times even misled about what our government was able to do. I was often told that Jim never the case. And actually, President Obama's strong stance against him was never going to enter into any negotiation on his behalf. So it was a very disappointing time. And that is why we started the Foley Foundation, because there was a need to improve this. It was really appalling in many ways.
Were you working mostly with the State Department, or was that part of the problem, that it wasn't really clear which branch of the government you should most be interfacing with?
That is the case, Matt. In his first brief captivity in Libya, it was clear that it was the State Department. But actually, Jim got out of that situation through the owner of the Atlantic Media, David Bradley, and his research. He's the one that enabled that his freedom in that regard. But the second time, FBI was the lead, but they did not coordinate with State Department. So it was very confusing about who was doing what and if anyone was doing anything, to be honest, Matt. So it was a very discouraging time, except for family and other people outside of government trying to support us.
Did you reach out during that time to members of Congress or the Senate?
Oh, yes. Not so much Congress, to be honest. I didn't know who to reach out to. We were assigned an FBI agent who recommended that we talk to President Assad. He just had no understanding of the situation there at all. Did not speak Arabic, was very frightening, actually. And at State Department, we always met with different people. They're always kind, very patronizing to me, but never told me anything. I did reach out to Senator Ayotte and Shaheen, and they were very supportive, did get me in touch with UN and other people, but really didn't know how to guide me, if you will. I really struggled. I quit my job and started going to Washington full time towards the end of Jim's captivity, just trying to find someone who could advocate for Jim. But I wasn't really ever able to find anyone during his captivity.
Did anybody explain or talk to you at the time about the political situation? And I use that in the largest sense, the political situation in Syria, because at the time things were very tumultuous and unknown, and various of the extremist groups were, in fact, having their own civil war. It was a very, very unsettled situation, to say the least. Did anybody ever really debrief you about those kinds of issues and what was going on and how deep the various occurrence were in the places where Jim was held?
Well, I was very aware of that on my own. And yes, at one point, someone from State Department gave us some information, but we also did our own research. So we were very aware that this was a conflict zone, very aware that we had no diplomatic relations with Syria, very aware. We were told that there were really no CIA or anybody in country. But the one thing we were not told about, Paul, was the whole idea that President Obama was very against negotiating with terrorists. So the FBI's hands were tied. Even when the captors reached out to us, FBI agents were not able to interact directly with captors. That all of it was left up to us as a family to try to figure out how to negotiate, if you will, with the captors. So that piece should have been obvious to me, I guess, because our government wasn't government officials were not allowed to directly interact. So I should have surmised it perhaps, but it was never clearly articulated to me. If anything, the opposite was told. I was told the opposite, that Jim was their highest priority. So it was, in that sense, very confusing.
So let's talk a little bit about the work of the foundation. So part of your mission at the foundation is conducting research to ensure that hostage policy, U.S. hostage policy, is actually prioritizing the return of our citizens held abroad and assisting their families, so that people are not, as it sounds like you found yourself in the position of doing, sort of having to invent all these wheels and forge all these channels on their own. And you also work on how to engage and how to make all these institutions in the federal government engage, the Congress, the White House, the FBI, the Department of State, to push for improvements in U.S. hostage policy. So what has the foundation advocated for in recent years that the U.S. government needs to do better? I have some guesses based on your experience, but what has that agenda been?
Well, the best thing, the most exciting thing was President Obama realized too late for Jim and the other 6 Americans at that time who were held hostage, but he, at the end of his time as president, he issued a total U.S. hostage policy review, which was both internal and external. So it included hostage families like ourselves, what we had gone through. The National Counterterrorism Center did an excellent job. Took a lot of time, really, listening to families like myself and others who had gone through this, and issued a presidential policy directive number 30 in June of 2015. And that was really outstanding in that it called for the restructuring of the way our government seeks to bring Americans home, if you will. It established an interagency hostage fusion cell, a special presidential envoy for hostage affairs, and a hostage recovery group at the National Security Council and White House level. So that was a huge step forward, Matt. And I'm very grateful to the Obama administration for putting that in place, and for the Trump administration for continuing that presidential policy directive. I was on the Foley Foundation within 3 weeks of Jim's murder. We became very active in all of that effort to make sure that was put in place. And we have continued that advocacy through our annual research reports. We annually interview hostage families, returned hostages, to see where the gaps are, where the government needs to improve their interaction with families, their transparency, and also how NGOs like ourselves can fill in gaps. Because the truth is that getting Americans home when taken hostage or wrongfully detained is very complex work. It requires a lot of very shrewd diplomacy. It is very complicated. So the government can't do it all, in truth. I mean, the government's job, to me, in my opinion, is to prioritize the return and to facilitate all that the government can do, but it also requires other people outside of government, I feel. So that is our job. Part of our job, anyway, is to work with Congress to help make public and our own government more aware of the rising number of Americans. For the number 44 is just the tip of a quite large iceberg, we feel, because there are thousands of Americans detained every year by other governments, and we really don't know how many are unjustly or wrongfully detained.
Wow. That's a pretty staggering thought to consider. because while, as you've just said, 44 is sort of the public number of hostages that we know about, thinking about the way that number is relates to the thousands of other detentions by both established foreign governments and then other groups which we may not even know about is a pretty staggering consideration. I have two questions. First, and forgive me for my ignorance, I had not heard of the National Center for Counterterrorism, and I'm curious where that is. It an agency, and where does it sit in the structure of our federal government? Is it allied with the State Department, or is it its own separate agency?
It was established after 9/11, and it's quite robust. I mean, it is. It's in Virginia. Where is it? Is it in McLean? Perhaps it's its own entity. And that is why President Obama chose, they initially tried to do this evaluation within their own government, within the White House, if you will. But they finally realized they needed an outside expertise to look at both inside government and outside government, and why everything was worked so poorly in regard to the 5 Americans who were killed in that time frame, murdered abroad, if you will. So I think it was a very wise choice to go outside. I think that took some humility and courage to do that. And I'm very grateful. I really am. I'm very grateful for that. And things have continued to move forward in that recently the Robert Levinson family, another hostage, gentleman who served for many years in our own CIA, was taken hostage and never recovered. So their family, the Robert Levinson Act, was just passed on a bipartisan basis. And this will mandate that the State Department actually has to look at the thousands of Americans detained each year and figure out who, in fact, is wrongfully or unjustly detained. And that'll be a very important step, because our fear is that the number is so much higher than this 44. We find new families in need of help every other day. I mean, this is a much bigger problem than we ever imagined.
One of the things that strikes me in hearing your experience, and as you talk about the complication here, is that there are many sort of subset problems to deal with. It is truly a very complex situation. There are instances where, as Jim experienced, Americans might be held by terrorist groups, by non-government groups. There are also instances where Americans might be wrongly detained, and it might be part of a judicial system, but one that doesn't follow actual transparent judicial procedures, that allows for families to pursue family vendettas, or governments to detain people for political purposes. Have you done work on trying to think through those complexities and the many different ways that the U.S. government might have to approach those different situations?
Absolutely, Matthew. That's what makes it so complicated. And I think my feeling is that our government has a sacred obligation, if you will, to protect the life and liberty of American citizens. And so this could have truly happened to any person. It could happen to a tourist. It could happen to a student going on a year abroad, or a research graduate student. It has happened to all of those categories. It isn't only journalists. It could happen to any international affairs person, or a businessman doing international work. So I feel that our government needs to find ways to negotiate in the in the complexity that it is, because it's certainly complicated. But to just plain say we will not negotiate with certain groups, like they did in Jim's case, is to truly abandon them. Because if our government cannot use the resources of our diplomats, our intelligence groups to figure out how to engage, for one thing, we lose a lot of understanding about what we're up against. Like if FBI and CIA had truly engaged in the 4 Americans who were held in that time frame by ISIS, they would have found out a lot about what was going on with ISIS, what in fact they wanted, what their interests were, if you will. Just plain the engagement itself would have given our government a lot of information. But by choosing not to engage at all, there's no chance for the hostage to come home, and we miss out on gleaning information about people who take our citizens, if you will. So I certainly don't have all the answers, Matthew. All I know is I feel our government, with all the talented folks in both the State Department and other branches of government, need to prioritize and use the most shrewd approaches. Our enemies certainly do. They know how to, the captors certainly know how to do this. And I think Americans can do this also. We must. I feel like we need to do this. So that is what we aspire to inspire moral courage. We feel our government needs to have the moral courage to find ways to look at this ever-growing problem and solve it, if you will.
Diane, we've talked a little bit about some of the positive changes that have resulted from your advocacy, and it sounds like there are some ways things are headed in a more effective direction with more coordination and more awareness. And you've pointed out that both under Presidents Obama and Trump, things are moving in somewhat a more effective direction. And we talked a little bit about the need to treat different cases differently, because right now there remains controversy over U.S. government policy on hostages. Other countries pay ransoms. It is usual for us to hear of European countries paying ransoms to free their citizens. This goes beyond the issue of, in a way, of negotiating, but it is contained within that question around negotiating. The U.S. government refuses to pay ransom. Is that something that should change?
Well, I don't feel the hard part about paying ransom, obviously, is that you might encourage more hostage taking, and you're going to, do exactly what the captors want. So that is not necessarily the answer at all. But I do feel that our government needs to prioritize the return of our citizens by engaging with captors. And sometimes it's by saying that we will not engage with the government, such as the question, should we really engage with Iran while they're holding a number of American citizens? That's a question that, is it morally right for us to decrease sanctions in Iran when they continue to take our citizens and dual nationals. That in that way, looking at that and prioritizing the fact that we're not going to deal with people, with governments that hold our citizens. Many of our citizens are being held in Egypt. That's another example. Russia. There are many situations where we could refuse to engage with them unless they release our citizens. There's other situations where we need to find out ways to negotiate and be shrewd about what they're looking for. I think ransom is only one aspect. And yes, it is one aspect that a lot of times some captors want. Certainly terrorist criminal groups tend to want ransom. It's of note that domestically, when people take our citizens or hold them captive, our Treasury does in fact pay ransoms in domestic cases. And I think so, ransom is used sometimes in the case of when our citizens are held, and that is the case domestically. But we've made a decision as a government that we will not use that in negotiating with terrorists. Is that right or wrong? I mean, that is something our government needs to look at. But I do feel it's only one means of negotiation. There are many others. Sanctions is another one, freezing funds, not engaging. There's many other ways to interact with people who take our citizens.
So, Diane, your answer kind of brings me up short. I mean, we've just lived through January 6th. We've seen what happens when domestic extremists are emboldened, in this case, attacking the Capitol in a murderous insurrection. But when you have your answer to the last question, you talked about domestic terrorists holding Americans hostage and negotiations and ransom being paid. Can you elaborate for us a little bit about the state of domestic terrorism and any Americans that are held by domestic groups? Is that what you're talking about?
Well, it is, but however, that is not an area that I know much about, because the focus of our work are citizens who are held internationally, so taken hostage abroad. Domestically, we have a very different policy, though. The FBI directly negotiates with domestic terrorists. If you look back historically, and we do, we take a lot of time to use. Gary Nesner was the head of the Terrorism Negotiation Center for many, many years, and he's written several books about it. So our FBI has a lot of expertise in negotiating with people who terrorize within our country and finding ways to free hostages. And I guess what I'm asking our government to do is to use our similar talents and expertise in these complex international kidnappings.
I want to touch on one aspect of Jim's case and of the foundation's work, which is the fact that he was a journalist. This is something that touches me personally. My father was an overseas conflict zone journalist. He was actually captured briefly by Idi Amin in Uganda in the course of his reporting, and somehow shrewdly managed to work his way out of that situation. Many journalists detained abroad do not. What are the special considerations, the special challenges that go with the entire issue of journalists reporting in conflict zones overseas? And what does the foundation advocate for, especially when it comes to the safety and release of journalists?
I appreciate that question, Matt, because I feel that the best of journalists are our way to know the truth. These days, there's a lot of disinformation, a lot of confusion about what is the truth. And I feel that the best journalists dig hard, whether it's domestically or by going into really dangerous zones internationally. But to be honest, to go deep into many of our issues domestically has become equally dangerous with it, because we have a lot of online trolling and the disinformation. We have a lot of safety issues brought on by the internet, if you will, and such a different way of reporting. So we have developed two types of preventative safety curricula, one for undergraduate and one for graduate journalist students. And what we're trying to accomplish is we want every single aspiring journalist to have basic safety education, to know how to assess the risk of whatever topic they're seeking to investigate, whether, like I say, it's domestic or international, and to really know how to protect themselves with digital safety also, to really know the ways that people can follow you and terrorize you, really, as a truth seeker. We also, as journalists, have a responsibility to protect sources, to protect vulnerable people who are sharing their experience. So we're very passionate about this preventative safety education, and we're really hoping in the future to make it grow so that it's totally free. So we have several universities that work with us who share it with students interested in political science, international affairs, and such, because we're seeking to create a culture of safety for anyone who is doing risky work. And certainly the work of journalists today can be very risky work.
You know, Diane, I have a close family friend, the son of dear friends. You know, a young man that we basically grew up with, who has chosen a career as an independent photojournalist overseas, and has taken himself to conflict zones. He was for quite a while living in East Sudan, I think it was, and traveling around Somalia and Sudan during a period of really serious conflict. He did at one point go get in and out of Syria, and he was trying to build his career as an independent photojournalist at the time, with, as far as I could tell, no exterior training. No resources to support him other than his wits and his camera. I mean, he's a smart, dedicated, passionate person. I'm curious whether, in addition to the education programs that you have talked about at universities, there are programs or efforts being made to educate and support journalists who may be out in the field as we speak, doing this really important work, because this is work that lets the world know what's going on in places we would not otherwise have any access to. So it's vital work from the point of view of journalism and education, and letting and raising the world's consciousness about what's going on. But I'm wondering if there's what, if any, kind of support or education is available to folks who are doing the work.
Absolutely, Paul. You're making a huge point. And actually, that was one of the things we did within the year after Jim died, is we helped found this Alliance for a Culture of Safety. And what that is is it's a coalition of press freedom groups, media groups, and freelancers, because there are more and more freelance journalists like your friend's son these days, because print journalism has just plain decreased. And so more and more of the news and photos we get are from independent journalists who do not have the security safety net. They often don't have access to hostile environment first aid training. They often have no health insurance, for example, kidnapping insurance, none of that sort of thing. So that's why we established this international coalition. So through this coalition, ACOS, we annually support freelancers so that they can afford to go to the 4 and 5 day hostile environment training. We have gotten media companies to help pay for this. It's expensive training, and it's training that's difficult to access if you're an independent journalist, because it takes time and a lot of money to have the training. But we are working very hard to promote that training and to promote insurance for freelancers as well as security input. Because you're right, these freelancers need to be able to access security experts about what countries they're going to, what they might encounter. That's all part of their risk assessment, if you will. So we work very hard with the Committee to Protect Journalists, Reporters Without Borders, many of the other press freedom groups within this Alliance for a Culture of Safety, because you're absolutely right. There's a real need for this. So through a coalition like this, we're able to help a lot more freelancers, if you will, to have access to those resources.
Another part of your mission is to raise awareness about specific cases. And as Paul mentioned at the top of the show, that you've released a report highlighting the at least 44 Americans that are in that position of being unjustly detained abroad. Are there any cases that you'd like to highlight here for our listeners where that kind of publicity would be helpful to their situation? Anyone you'd like to talk about?
Oh goodness, Paul, there are so many. There's two very poignant cases in Syria right now. There's this young Texan, Austin Tice, who's been held now nearly 10 years. Georgetown law student, very talented young man. Maj Kamalmaz, Dr. Kamalmaz is a psychotherapist helping people in refugee zones who went to visit a family member in Syria and was just taken. We have, the Sitco Six, if you will, who are the Sitco executives from southern part of the United States, Louisiana and Texas, who were lured to Venezuela and then taken hostage. We have, Pastor Jeffrey Woodkey, who was taken in Niger. We have two of our citizens being held in Russia right now. But the other problem we've encountered is that even when our citizens are able to come home, what they say that what they face after 4 or 5 years in detention is appalling. The IRS goes after them. Why haven't they paid their taxes? Loans or rent or bills, or, there's much work to be done to support traumatized citizens when they, in fact, are thankfully able to come home. So we have much work to do, Matt, to be honest. We have 12 hostages who have asked for advocacy, who are on our website at jamesfoleyfoundation.org. So some of those cases people can go to and learn more. And also our annual report when we talk about anonymously about the issues they're facing. But there's a lot to do, if you will.
It's clearly a lifetime of work and very, very important work. I keep thinking about our military, where the military code is leave no one behind. It's a very clear imperative in the military. And your work has just done so much to change the culture in the United States government, and hopefully the code about the way we approach these very, very intricate and challenging situations. I'm sure that our listeners who have heard this program will be moved and inspired to want to help and to do something. I'd like to tell you that we have millions of listeners, but I sometimes joke and say our dozens of listeners, I'm sure.
We have at least 10,000 a day, Paul. Don't undersell.
Will be moved to want to help. What can people do who are touched by the stories you've told and what we've heard from you? How do you advise that they take action? What's the best and biggest thing people can do, and how would you like them to reach out and just what can folks do?
Well, I thank you so very much for that question, because our tagline is inspiring moral courage in every American and anyone who's listening. Let us not leave behind abandoned Americans who are out in the world, because we need to be out in the world, hopefully bringing peace and some help to other parts of the world. So I don't think the answer is to stay home at all. I think the world needs our expertise, compassion, and goodness out in the world. But I would invite anyone to become a friend of the James Foley Legacy Foundation. One could find out more information by watching a documentary called Jim, the James Foley Story. It is on HBO, Amazon, YouTube. It's everywhere. But that would help you understand some of what our situation was like. And we would greatly appreciate anyone who wants to join us in our annual Freedom Run. There are many ways people can, first of all, just learn about the issue. I was so ignorant about the fact that Americans are taken hostage, kidnapped abroad, and until it came home to me. So I would ask anyone listening to please learn about this issue and help us protect fellow citizens who go out into the world on our behalf, and help us bring them home. I would just be deeply grateful.
Diane, thank you so much for joining us on Beyond Politics. I'm Paul Hodes with my co-host, Matt Robeson. We've been speaking with Diane Foley, the president, founder of the James W. Foley Legacy Foundation, working at so many different levels to help Americans who are taken abroad, who are detained abroad. Thank you, Diane, for your work. And folks, if you're listening to this on our podcast, please subscribe and tell your friends about Beyond Politics. We'll be back next week with another show. Thanks so much.